Lieutenant Colonel James Mitchell had served the British Crown for 23 years. His chest bore the weight of medals earned through blood, sweat, and sacrifice on battlefields across Afghanistan and Iraq. But among all his decorations, one stood above the rest: the Victoria Cross, Britain's highest military honor. The medal came with a story that still gave James nightmares. During a fierce firefight in Helmand Province, his unit had been ambushed by Taliban fighters. When an improvised explosive device trapped 6 soldiers in a burning vehicle, James didn't hesitate. He ran through enemy fire 3 times, pulling each man to safety, while bullets whistled past his ears. The final rescue nearly cost him his life when shrapnel tore through his shoulder, but all 6 soldiers lived to see their families again. Now, at 52 years old, James was preparing for what should have been a routine flight home to London. He had been visiting his elderly mother in Manchester, and the 2-hour flight to Heathrow seemed simple enough. He dressed in his formal military uniform, complete with his service medals, as was customary when traveling on official business. The morning sun cast long shadows across Manchester Airport as James approached the check-in counter. The young woman behind the desk looked up with a professional smile that quickly faded when she saw his military attire. Her eyes lingered on his medals, particularly the distinctive bronze cross hanging from its crimson ribbon. "Good morning, sir. May I see your identification and boarding pass?" she asked, her voice carrying a hint of uncertainty. James handed over his military identification and ticket. The woman studied the documents carefully, then looked back at his uniform with growing suspicion. She called over her supervisor, a middle-aged man with thinning hair and a permanent frown etched across his face. "Is there a problem?" James asked politely, though he could sense tension building. The supervisor examined James's identification with exaggerated thoroughness. "These medals, sir. Are they real?" The question hit James like a physical blow. In all his years of service, through combat zones and ceremonial duties, no one had ever questioned the authenticity of his decorations. The Victoria Cross on his chest represented the darkest day of his military career, but also his finest hour. "Yes, they are absolutely real," James replied, maintaining his composure despite the insult. The supervisor's frown deepened. "We've had issues lately with people wearing fake military decorations. These medals look quite elaborate. Do you have documentation proving their authenticity?" James felt his patience beginning to thin. "Sir, I am a serving officer in Her Majesty's Royal Guard. These medals were awarded to me by the Crown. I don't typically carry certificates of authenticity when I travel." The situation was drawing attention from other passengers. A small crowd had gathered, some filming with their phones, others whispering among themselves. James could hear snippets of their conversations, some defending him, others questioning whether his uniform was genuine. "I'm going to need to call security," the supervisor announced loudly. "We cannot allow passengers to board with potentially fraudulent military items." "Fraudulent?" James's voice rose slightly, his military training warring with his growing anger. "That Victoria Cross represents the lives of 6 soldiers. It's not some costume jewelry purchased online." The supervisor was unmoved. "Anyone can buy military surplus these days. We need to verify these items before you can board." Airport security arrived within minutes. 3 officers who approached James as if he were a common criminal. Other passengers stared openly now, their phones capturing every moment of his humiliation. James could see the judgment in their eyes, the assumption that he was some kind of fraud trying to gain attention or special treatment. "Sir, we need you to come with us for verification," the lead security officer said, his hand resting on his radio. James looked around at the gathering crowd, at the airline employees treating him like a criminal, at the phones recording his embarrassment. 23 years of faithful service, countless sacrifices for his country, and this was how he was being treated by his fellow citizens. "I'll come willingly," he said quietly, "but I want you all to remember this moment." As security escorted him away from the check-in counter, James could hear passengers discussing what they had witnessed. Some expressed outrage at his treatment, while others seemed convinced he was indeed a fraud. The airline supervisor watched with satisfaction, apparently pleased with his diligence in catching what he believed to be a fake soldier. The security office was a small, sterile room with fluorescent lighting that made everything look harsh and unwelcoming. James sat in an uncomfortable plastic chair, while security officers photographed his medals and uniform from every angle. They treated each decoration like evidence in a criminal investigation. "These photos will be sent to military authorities for verification," the lead officer explained. "Until we receive confirmation, you will not be permitted to board your flight." James checked his watch. His flight was departing in 90 minutes, but he suspected this process would take much longer. How long does verification typically take? Could be several hours, could be days. The officer replied with a shrug. Depends on how quickly the military responds. The absurdity of the situation was overwhelming. Here was James, a decorated war hero, being detained because airport staff couldn't believe that a real soldier would travel through their terminal. The irony wasn't lost on him. He had faced enemy fire without flinching, but bureaucratic ignorance was proving to be a more formidable opponent. As he sat in that sterile room, James thought about the soldiers under his command, the young men and women who looked up to him for leadership and guidance. What would they think if they could see their commanding officer being treated like a common criminal? What message did this send about how society valued military service? The hours ticked by slowly. James missed his original flight, then the next one. The airline offered no apology, no accommodation, only the cold assurance that policy was being followed. He called his wife to explain the delay, struggling to find words for the humiliation he was experiencing. Outside the security office, word of the incident was spreading. Social media posts about the fake soldier at Manchester Airport were multiplying, with videos of James's detention being shared thousands of times. The court of public opinion was quick to judge, with many assuming the airline's assessment was correct. But among those watching the unfolding drama was someone who recognized the man in the uniform. Sarah Williams, a military journalist covering veterans affairs, happened to be in the airport when she saw the commotion. She knew exactly who James Mitchell was. She had written about his Victoria Cross citation 3 years earlier. Sarah immediately began making phone calls, reaching out to military contacts and veterans organizations. She knew that if this was really Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell being detained, a grave injustice was taking place. The man she had interviewed was a genuine hero, not some pretender seeking attention. As evening approached, James remained in detention, while the airline insisted on following protocol. The verification process that should have taken minutes was stretching into hours due to bureaucratic inefficiency and weekend staffing limitations. Unknown to James, however, his story was about to reach people who would ensure that justice was served. The seeds of what would become a media firestorm were already being planted, and the airline that had so casually dismissed a war hero was about to face consequences they never could have imagined. The first part of James Mitchell's ordeal was ending, but his fight for dignity and respect was just beginning. The very system he had sworn to protect was failing him. But sometimes, the most powerful responses come from the most unexpected places. Sarah Williams wasted no time. From her position near the departure gates, she began live tweeting the unfolding situation. Her followers included military personnel, journalists, and veterans advocates across the United Kingdom. Within minutes of her first tweet identifying the detained passenger as Lieutenant Colonel James Mitchell, Victoria Cross recipient, the story began spreading like wildfire. Breaking: decorated war hero Lieutenant Cole James Mitchell, VC, being detained at Manchester Airport. Airline staff claim his medals are fake. This is the man who saved 6 soldiers in Afghanistan. Absolutely disgraceful treatment. The response was immediate and explosive. Veterans organizations began sharing the story. Military wives posted outraged comments, and serving soldiers expressed their shock at the treatment of their commanding officer. The hashtag number Justice for James Mitchell began trending within hours. Meanwhile, James remained in the security office, unaware of the growing storm outside. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as he sat in the same uncomfortable chair, watching airport staff treat his medals like suspicious artifacts. Every few minutes, someone would enter to take more photographs or ask the same questions he had already answered a dozen times. "Sir, we're still waiting for military verification," the security supervisor informed him for the 5th time. "It's taking longer than usual, Because it's Saturday evening. James looked at his watch. 7 hours had passed since his original flight departure. The airline had offered him a seat on Sunday morning's first flight, but only after the verification process was complete. No apology was offered, no acknowledgement that their treatment might have been excessive. "May I at least call my commanding officer to expedite this process?" James asked. "That won't be necessary, sir. We follow proper channels." But proper channels were about to be bypassed entirely. Colonel Patricia Hayes, James's direct superior and a close friend, received an urgent call from a military journalist asking for comment on the Manchester airport incident. Patricia's initial confusion quickly turned to rage as the situation was explained to her. Within minutes, she was on the phone with the airport's general manager, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "You are currently detaining one of Britain's most decorated soldiers. Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell has served this country with distinction for over 2 decades. This treatment is absolutely unacceptable." The airport manager, David Thompson, found himself in an increasingly uncomfortable position. "We were simply following security protocols, Colonel. We had reason to believe." "You had reason to believe nothing," Patricia cut him off. "Your staff made assumptions based on ignorance and prejudice. I want Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell released immediately, with a full apology." But the damage was already spreading far beyond Manchester Airport. The story had reached television newsrooms, where weekend editors recognized its potential impact. By early evening, camera crews were en route to the airport, and reporters were reaching out to military officials for comment. Admiral Sir Michael Richardson, head of the Royal Navy's public affairs, received an urgent briefing about the situation while attending a dinner party in London. His immediate response was to contact the Minister of Defence personally. "Minister, we have a situation that requires immediate attention. One of our Victoria Cross recipients is being treated shamefully by airline staff." The minister, Catherine Walsh, was initially skeptical. Surely this was some kind of misunderstanding that could be resolved quietly. But as her staff briefed her on the growing social media outcry and confirmed James's identity and service record, she realized this was no minor incident. "Get me the airline's chief executive on the phone immediately," she ordered. At Manchester Airport, James finally learned about the growing support for his situation when Sarah Williams approached the security office. She identified herself as a journalist and asked to speak with him briefly. "Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell, I don't know if you remember me, but I interviewed you about your Victoria Cross 3 years ago. I want you to know that people across the country are learning about what's happening to you, and they're outraged." For the first time in hours, James felt something other than frustration and embarrassment. "People know about this? Sir, your story is everywhere. Veterans, serving soldiers, civilians. Everyone is demanding answers. You're not alone in this." Sarah showed him her phone, displaying hundreds of supportive messages flooding social media. Soldiers from his own regiment had posted photos of themselves with James from various military ceremonies. Veterans shared their own stories of discrimination and poor treatment. Military families expressed their anger at seeing a war hero humiliated. But the most powerful posts came from the families of the 6 soldiers James had saved in Afghanistan. Mary Thompson, whose son David was one of the rescued soldiers, posted a photo of her son's wedding day with James standing proudly as best man. "This man saved my son's life. He risked everything so David could come home to us. Seeing him treated like this breaks my heart. Lieutenant Cole Mitchell is a true hero, and everyone should know it." The story was also reaching international audiences. Military blogs in the United States, Canada, and Australia picked up the story, with veterans organizations worldwide expressing solidarity with James. The British Embassy in Washington received calls from American military leaders offering support. As evening news programs began featuring the story, the airline found itself facing a public relations nightmare. Their phones were ringing constantly with angry callers demanding explanations. Social media comments on their official pages were overwhelmingly negative, with many threatening boycotts. Chief Executive Officer Richard Barnes finally received the call he had been dreading from the Minister of Defence. Her message was clear and direct. "Mr. Barnes, Your staff's treatment of Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell is completely unacceptable. I want this resolved immediately, with appropriate apologies and compensation. Barnes, realizing the gravity of the situation, immediately contacted Manchester Airport. Release Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell immediately. Full apology. Whatever it takes to make this right. But by then, it was too late to contain the story. Television crews had arrived at the airport, and James's release was broadcast live to the nation. As he walked out of the security office, still in his uniform with his medals gleaming under the television lights, he was met by a crowd of supporters who had gathered at the airport. Among them were several veterans who had driven from across the region to show their support. Retired Sergeant Major William Bill Foster, who had served under James in Afghanistan, stepped forward with tears in his eyes. "Sir, when we heard what was happening to you, we had to come. You saved lives. You served with honor. And you deserve better than this." The crowd erupted in applause as James emerged. Reporters pushed forward with questions, but James remained composed and dignified despite his ordeal. "I want to thank everyone who stood up for me today," he said quietly. "What happened here isn't really about me. It's about how we treat those who serve our country. Every soldier, sailor, airman, and Marine deserves respect, not suspicion." The airline's customer service manager approached with a prepared statement, but his words rang hollow after hours of treating James like a criminal. "On behalf of the airline, we apologize for any inconvenience." "Inconvenience?" interrupted a voice from the crowd. "You humiliated a war hero." The crowd's anger was palpable, and James had to raise his hand to calm them. "Thank you all. But let's not make this worse. I just want to go home to my family." But as James finally boarded a flight home, he had no idea that his story was about to reach the highest levels of British society. The wheels of justice were already turning, and those responsible for his treatment were about to face consequences that would shock everyone involved. The second phase of his ordeal was ending, but the most dramatic developments were still to come. James Mitchell finally arrived home late Sunday night, exhausted and emotionally drained from his 24-hour ordeal. His wife Emma met him at the door, her eyes filled with tears of both relief and anger. She had watched the news coverage throughout the day, seeing her husband's dignity slowly restored through the outpouring of public support. "The children want to see you," she said softly. They saw some of the news coverage and were worried. 8-year-old Sophie and 12-year-old Michael rushed to embrace their father, still wearing his uniform. Sophie looked up at his medals with new understanding of their importance, while Michael struggled to comprehend why anyone would doubt his father's heroism. "Daddy, why did those people say your medals weren't real?" Sophie asked innocently. James knelt down to her level, choosing his words carefully. "Sometimes people make mistakes, sweetheart. But what matters is that good people stood up for what was right." What James didn't know was that his story had reached Buckingham Palace. Private Secretary Sir Edward Fitzwilliam had briefed the royal family about the incident during their regular Sunday evening briefing. The response was immediate and unprecedented. By Monday morning, James received a phone call that would change everything. Colonel Patricia Hayes called personally with news that left him speechless. "James, I need you to sit down. Her Majesty the Queen wishes to see you personally at Buckingham Palace this afternoon. She wants to express her personal dismay at your treatment and reaffirm the nation's gratitude for your service." James was stunned. In all his years of service, including receiving the Victoria Cross, he had never imagined a personal audience with the Queen over such a matter. "Are you certain, ma'am? This seems extraordinary. James, what happened to you has touched the highest levels of government and the royal family. This afternoon's meeting is just the beginning." Meanwhile, the airline was facing a crisis of unprecedented proportions. Social media campaigns calling for boycotts had gained hundreds of thousands of supporters. Travel booking websites were flooded with negative reviews. Stock prices had dropped significantly as investors worried about long-term damage to the company's reputation. Chief Executive Richard Barnes called an emergency board meeting for Monday morning. The company's public relations team had worked through the weekend trying to develop a response strategy, but the damage seemed to be spreading faster than they could contain it. "Gentlemen, ladies," Barnes addressed the board, "we are facing the worst public relations crisis in the company's history. One incident at Manchester Airport has cost us millions in lost bookings and damaged our reputation globally. Board member Sarah Chen, the company's former military liaison, shook her head in disgust. Richard, this wasn't just an incident. Your staff humiliated a Victoria Cross recipient. Do you understand what that medal represents? Barnes was beginning to understand, but the full weight of his company's mistake was still sinking in. What do you recommend we do? First, fire everyone involved in the decision to detain Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell. Second, implement immediate training for all staff about military decorations. Third, make a substantial charitable donation to veterans organizations. And fourth, pray that this doesn't destroy the company entirely. But even these measures would prove insufficient for what was coming. At Buckingham Palace, James stood in his dress uniform in the same room where he had originally received his Victoria Cross. But this meeting felt different, more personal, more emotional. When the Queen entered, her expression conveyed both warmth and genuine anger about his treatment. Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell, she began, her voice carrying the weight of royal authority. What happened to you this weekend was an affront not just to your service, but to every person who has worn the uniform of our armed forces. Your Majesty, I appreciate your concern, but I don't want this incident to overshadow the positive support I've received. The Queen smiled slightly. Your humility is admirable, but sometimes institutions must be reminded of their responsibilities. What you experienced represents a failure of respect that goes far beyond one airline's mistake. She then made an announcement that would send shockwaves through British society. I am personally removing this airline's royal warrant. They will no longer be recognized as official carriers for the royal family. Furthermore, I am establishing a new military recognition program to ensure that the sacrifices of our service members are properly honored. The news of the royal family's unprecedented intervention spread globally within hours. The airline's stock price plummeted further as investors realized the full scope of the reputational damage. Losing the royal warrant was more than symbolic. It was a public declaration that the company had failed to meet the highest standards of British society. But the Queen's actions were only the beginning of the institutional response. Prime Minister Jonathan Harrison announced a parliamentary inquiry into discrimination against military personnel. What happened to Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell cannot be allowed to happen to any service member ever again. The Ministry of Defense implemented new guidelines requiring all transportation companies serving military personnel to undergo sensitivity training. Veterans organizations were given expanded authority to investigate complaints of discrimination. Meanwhile, the individual employees who had initiated James's detention faced personal consequences that shocked their colleagues. Airport Supervisor David Thompson was immediately terminated and found himself unemployable in the aviation industry. The check-in clerk who first questioned James's medals was demoted and required to undergo extensive retraining. But the most dramatic consequence came when the airline's board of directors met in emergency session on Tuesday morning. The financial losses were mounting rapidly, with analysts predicting the company could lose hundreds of millions in revenue. Several major corporate clients had canceled contracts in solidarity with military organizations. Richard, board chairwoman Margaret Sinclair addressed the CEO. The situation has become untenable. Your leadership during this crisis has been inadequate. Within hours, Richard Barnes announced his resignation, accepting full responsibility for the company's handling of the incident. His departure sent a clear message that discriminating against military personnel would have serious professional consequences. The new CEO, retired Air Marshal Sir David Wright, was specifically chosen for his military background. His first action was to personally visit James at his home with a formal apology and a substantial compensation package. Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell, Sir David said, standing at attention in James's living room. On behalf of every employee of this airline, I offer our deepest apologies. Your treatment was inexcusable, and we are committed to ensuring this never happens again. The compensation package included a lifetime of free first-class travel for James and his family, a substantial financial settlement, and the airline's commitment to fund a military family support center in his name. But perhaps the most meaningful response came from an unexpected source. The 6 soldiers James had saved in Afghanistan organized a surprise gathering at his local veterans club. David Thompson, the soldier whose wedding James had attended as best man, stood up to address the crowd. When Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell saved our lives, he didn't think about medals or recognition. He just did what was right. This week, we've seen what happens when a grateful nation stands up for someone who has always stood up for others. The celebration was broadcast live on national television, showing James surrounded by the men whose lives he had saved and their families. The contrast between this scene and his humiliation at Manchester Airport couldn't have been more powerful. As weeks passed, the incident's long-term effects became clear. Parliament passed new legislation protecting military personnel from discrimination. Airlines across the country implemented mandatory training about military decorations and service records. A new national curriculum was developed to teach young people about military service and sacrifice. James returned to his duties with the Royal Guard, but he found that his experience had given him a new perspective on civilian-military relations. He began speaking at schools and community groups about the importance of understanding and respecting military service. What happened to me wasn't really about one airline or a few employees, he would tell audiences. It was about our responsibility as a society to understand and value the sacrifices made by those who serve. The airline, under new leadership, became one of the strongest supporters of military personnel in the industry. They established annual scholarships for military families, created special services for wounded veterans, and regularly honored service members through their customer recognition programs. 3 months after the incident, James received one final surprise. The 6 soldiers he had saved in Afghanistan had privately funded a scholarship in his name for children of fallen service members. The announcement was made during a ceremony at the Imperial War Museum, with hundreds of veterans and their families in attendance. As James stood once again before cameras and crowds, this time by choice rather than circumstance, he reflected on how a weekend of humiliation had become a catalyst for positive change. The young airline supervisor who had questioned his medals probably never imagined that his moment of poor judgment would lead to sweeping reforms in how Britain treats its veterans. The story of Lieutenant Colonel James Mitchell's weekend ordeal became more than just news. It became a defining moment in British military history. It showed that even in an era of social media outrage and instant judgment, genuine heroism and service still commanded respect and protection. Most importantly, it proved that when a society's values are challenged, good people will always stand up to defend what is right. James had saved 6 soldiers on a battlefield in Afghanistan, but his fellow citizens had saved his dignity at Manchester Airport. In both cases, the response came from ordinary people doing extraordinary things when it mattered most. The airline employee who started it all eventually wrote a letter of apology to James, expressing genuine remorse for his actions. James, true to his character, accepted the apology gracefully and even spoke at the young man's military appreciation training session months later. "We all make mistakes," James told him privately. "What matters is what we learn and how we grow from them." The incident that began with suspicion and ended with celebration reminded everyone involved that true strength comes not from the medals on a soldier's chest, but from the character of the person wearing them. And sometimes, it takes a moment of injustice to remind a grateful nation why those medals matter in the first place.